Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for August 14th, 2025. Well, the question now comes down to diplomacy or war. Who will make that decision? The battle lines have been drawn between two choices. A permanent war, which has the support of the Western military-industrial complex, the European leadership, neoconservatives in the House and Senate in the United States, and much of the media, or sustainable peace based on move to a development architecture. Now, the majority of nations hope for a triumph of diplomacy and a new security architecture which would replace the post-Cold War unipolar era, Anthony Blinken's beloved rules-based order, in which the rules are made to favor the wealthy nations based on enforcement of thy military power, or a move toward a multipolar or multinodal order, which is emerging based on cooperation for mutual benefit. Now, peace in this discussion process depends on security guarantees, and the Russians have consistently offered a plan for legitimate security for Russia and Ukraine, and a new security architecture for Europe, which includes Russia as a partner. The best guarantee to adopt that, or to achieve that, is to adopt the perspective of development of sovereign nations committed to acting for the benefit of their citizens in cooperation with policies which will benefit the citizens of all other nations. And that includes projects, major projects. And we in the LaRouche movement have a 5-decade experience with fighting for such development projects. That was the passion for LaRouche. Policies of economy which take the power out of the hands of monetarists, out of central bankers who act for the benefit of their private clients in corporate banking, real estate, insurance, finance, military production, and so on, and put it in the hands of the citizens. In other words, take control of monetary policy so that you use monetary policy for the benefit of the population, for the general welfare. The present system, a speculative system of funny money controlled by the central banks, is collapsing under the weight of unpayable debt. It's a speculative system where investment goes into increasingly wild speculation to back up worthless financial instruments on the books of financial institutions, what might be called the Epstein Model, versus investment in physical economy. So one of the issues before Trump and Putin will be, how do you shift the world economy from one controlled by speculators to one where sovereign nations act in the interests of their people? Now, in a monetarist system, who pays the debt? It's the citizens. They pay it through taxes. They pay it through austerity, cuts in necessary infrastructure spending, through inflation, cheap wages, cheap raw materials. It's a predatory system. It was set up after World War II, not as Franklin Roosevelt intended, but a financial system which was controlled by the wealthiest bankers and financial speculators. Now, this predatory system, especially with its looting of the poorer countries, the so-called global south, is one that leads to war, permanent war. And that's what we've been stuck in, especially since the first Gulf War, or I should say the Afghanistan War in the 80s. Now, instead, what LaRouche's proposal is based on is a Hamiltonian credit system with his 4 economic laws. 1, regulated banking, Glass-Steagall, separation of commercial banks and investment banks, so that the banking system is there as a channel for credit to the physical economy. So the second point, second law, is a Hamiltonian credit system, a banking system, a national banking system, which provides cheap credit for industrial development, for entrepreneurs, for agriculture, but not to allow for speculation to build up a debt system so that the interest rates are then manipulated to keep the banks, the so-called too big to fail banks, operating at the expense of the physical economy. The third point is investment in infrastructure, which, as infrastructure is modernized and improved, cheapens the cost of overall production and distribution. And the fourth point is funding in breakthroughs in the frontiers of science, including nuclear fusion, including space technology, that you have a robust science, research, and development sector. Now, will such a future orientation be on the agenda at tomorrow's summit in Alaska? Well, on both sides, there's been discussion that it's not just Ukraine on the agenda, but trade, financial policy, that is, settlement systems and so on, deployment or development of the Arctic region. Now, this is why the Larouche movement proposed that the Bering Strait Tunnel, as a joint project connecting Russia and the United States, be on the agenda, because this is the kind of future orientation in which both nations will rally their scientific community, their labor forces, their credit system to reach a connection between the two countries, but one which extends far beyond that, to connect Eurasia and the Americas. This is the kind of bold thinking for the future that should be on the agenda. And it's been discussed in Russia. Since we brought it up, it's been discussed in the United States. It's being discussed in Europe and in the developing sector. So the question is, will this come up between Presidents Trump and Putin? Now, we know what Europe is thinking. The Europeans had a conference call yesterday, and they basically said, keep the war going, that there should be no surrender to Putin. In other words, recognizing legitimate security interests as raised by President Putin since the Maidan coup of 2014, even discussing that is appeasement, is capitulation to Putin. Therefore, that means you have to keep the arms flowing, keep the money flowing for that, keep the dying going. That's the solution offered by Starmer, Macron, Merz. That's what you get from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and others. And the U.S. war hawks are typified by what the Wall Street Journal wrote yesterday. In a sense, trolling Donald Trump, saying that the summit, the very fact that there's a summit, represents a victory for Putin. And Trump did respond on Truth Social. He said, the very unfair media is at work. Now, what he could have gone further than that and said the very unfair media is committed to war. But the summit does represent an opportunity to break with the past. But for that to happen, the people's voice must be heard. In foreign policy, if you leave it to the Wall Street crowd, if you leave it to the lawyers, if you leave it to the bureaucrats at the State Department, the intelligence services, they're going to go for war. That's what they know. That's how they profit. They're going to protect the existing system. But the potential exists now to break with that past. And that's the opportunity of a lifetime. Who knows when we'll get this chance again, when the presidents of the two largest powers meet. And you'll see in the description section a letter from a letter from Helga Zepp-LaRouche calling for the meeting not just of Trump and Putin, but to include Xi Jinping. To have a break with 5 centuries of imperial policy through collaboration, through honest negotiation, that's the potential. And you need to speak out for that. We need to have a growing, robust voice of the people through demonstrations, through contacting your local representatives, just through a discussion process, not being afraid to say, this system is collapsing and we need a new system. So join us to fight for that. And also in the description section, there'll be a link to two voices that spoke out very clearly on this yesterday. A dialogue between Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Larry Johnson. And their dialogue is a thorough discussion of what the potential is at this moment. So listen to that and become active. Don't be a victim of bad policies on behalf of special interests. Let's bring down the special interests. The special interest of humanity is that sovereign nations work together for the benefit of all other nations. So that's what's at stake tomorrow, and that's something that is going to require a lot of work. It's going to go on past tomorrow, but let's get going in building this new security and development architecture for the future. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you again.